Now, we're going to look at what's grabbing the headlines here in France with Catherine Viette. Hello there, Catherine.
Hello.
Now, that we were talking about this in our main news bulletin, President François Hollande giving a major speech later on today. He's expected to talk democracy, terrorism. This, of course, as the country is still under a national state of emergency.
Right, so L'Opinion, the pro-business paper, on their front page, they dive right in with this headline, Hollande, the plunge. Now, as we were just mentioning, the talk today is being billed by Hollande's administration as the first step on the road to reconquer the French, part of a possible bid for re-election. The paper also has an illustration, a bit of an editorial cartoon, showing the president on the diving board, getting back to that headline, the plunge there. He's getting ready to jump into a pool. It's 3/4 empty, so the water level there is a symbol of his unpopularity, and he's saying, well, now I need a good rain. And in the editorial of the paper, the paper writes that Hollande has two adversaries. It's his track record in office and his friends, and it says that if the president is to stop the tailspin that sees him habitually at the bottom of the polls, then he needs to figure out a way to unite his party and to bring the dissenters back into the fold.
François Hollande really not a popular man in France right now. We've been citing a couple of polls that came out on Wednesday saying that 88% of French people don't want him to be back next time around.
Definitely not good news for him. And Le Figaro is sort of, picking up this theme there. It's a more conservative paper. It's never been a really big fan of Hollande, so not a bit of a surprise that it's focusing on this. But the paper sees that President Hollande is up against the wall. That's its headline. Sees a weakened president. Says that Hollande is a president who's willing to make big plays when he's pressed. A nod to the speech he's to give later today. And the paper says also that the Élysée has cleverly turned up the heat in recent days surrounding this speech as part of efforts to pre-sell it, which seem to have worked.
Meanwhile, Libération, the more left-leaning newspaper here in France, this sees this as the opening salvo in a big battle. What kind of battle are we talking about?
Yes, that's right. The paper here is reporting that Hollande is ready and calm for his reconquest, that word again, reconquest of the French people. And it says that what Hollande needs to do is to present himself as a guardian of the Republic and of the rule of law, and that he needs to lay out a clear vision of what the left is going to do, in contrast to the right now, which is sort of all over the place.
OK, now if we move on to the Catholic newspaper, La Croix, it's looking a bit closer at what politicians have called this war on terrorism. It's asking, what exactly are the challenges that are facing us in this sort of slightly nebulous concept?
That's exactly the question the paper is asking. They've talked to 5 experts, and they're wondering what are democracy's weapons in this war against terror. The paper goes on to say that the challenges of this issue are going to go beyond the election. So it's not just about politicking right now in the race for the presidential election here. Paper warns that the repeated bloody attacks on French soil, the attack on Bastille Day in Nice, the killing of the priest, all of this has brought up tensions again. It's straining national unity here in France. And it says, that one of the things that must not be done, we must not weaken our fundamental rights, from one of the experts here in France. Another says that we must love and support our country in face of this disunity. And finally, another is talking about breaking the bonds of hate propaganda. And an editorial from La Croix, it finally says that one of the things that weakens most democracies in the face of challenges such as these are hasty decisions and the inability to take the time for the much-needed reflection and debate.
Indeed. No one quite seems to have concrete answers, but it certainly feels like everyone in France wants something to be done. Moving on from terrorism to taxes, there's been so much talk this week about tax cuts being brought in.
Right, that's right. Hollande has announced a tax cut for the middle class. So Libération here talking about that tax cut, seeing it as the last gesture on the road, and seeing it also as another sign that Hollande is going to run for re-election. However, the paper here warns that this promised tax cut by the president isn't going to be enough to erase the failure of his tax policy, which the paper says favored businesses at the expense of purchasing power and growth.
And keeping things business-minded, other politicians are talking about ways to boost the so-called Made in France label, get production going here in France again.
Right, that was a movement that started back in 2010, and once again, it's back in the spotlight with the politicians discussing it as a possible way to revive manufacturing here in France. Now, Le Figaro is reporting on this very issue, and it says that it's one way to possibly reignite national pride. In its front page editorial, the paper writes that the promotion of Made in France requires two conditions: quality and competitiveness.
And just one final word on sexism. The government launching a campaign to try and stop sexism in daily life. What's that going to look like?
Right. So this comes from Le Parisien. We can take a look at their front page, and it says sexism. You also say stop. So it's a nod to the fact that everyone has to be involved in this, men as well as women. Now, the campaign's aims are to fight against what the paper says are the daily humiliations inflicted on women, such as catcalling in the street. And the paper warns that if more is not done now to combat this attitude, that the hard-earned ground that has been won in favor of women's rights could be lost at any moment.
All right, a whiz through some of the top stories in the French papers there. Thanks very much, Catherine Viet. Who'll be back later on looking at the international newspapers for us as well.